Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on Lake George Radio, 93.5 FM, and live streaming at lakegeorgeradio.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Alliance, John DiNuzzo.
Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments. This is John DiNuzzo, the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. I'm joined by Trustee Bruce Venter. Today we're going to talk about a very familiar name to Lake George, Queensbury area people, and that name is Halfway Brook, which is almost ubiquitous, certainly in the history books around this area, but also as you drive along Route 9, as you drive along Ridge Road, Bay Road, you pass over Halfway Brook. What does that name mean, first of all, Bruce?
Halfway Brook was halfway between Fort Edward and Lake George. The battlefield at Lake George, Fort William Henry was here. The armies of 1758 and 59 were here. And so it was a stopping point where the men could rest and refresh themselves in the babbling brook. And it became a place that was well known in the 18th century, particularly during the French and Indian War, but also during the Revolutionary War.
And were there particular stopping points that continued in notoriety, let's say, as the area evolved?
Well, William Johnson built a road from Fort Edward to Lake George, and he had to cross Halfway Brook. And that's how it became important. They built a stockaded fort in the beginning on the north side of the brook just to protect that crossing, because wagon trains would stop, and the wagon trains might have a guard with them, but not a full complement of soldiers. And so they were constantly worried about raids. And raids did occur. The French and their native allies would come down this way, and they would always look to knock off a convoy of supplies, food, ammunition, what have you. In 1758, there were two raids, one before the attack by Abercrombie, and then 2 weeks after the return of Abercrombie from his defeat up at Ticonderoga, Fort Caroline. He was back in his camp here at Lake George, and there was a supply train coming up, and they were actually attacked. And I did an analysis of this for the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance newsletter, the Fort George Post. In terms of percentages, more men, women, and even children were killed in the raid of July 1758 as a percentage than were killed in the massacre at Fort William Henry. Now, if anyone is interested in the articles that I wrote on Halfway Brook, the Fort George Post is online. If you're a member, it's easy to get to. If you're not a member, you can still use the website. There's a monument in Halfway Park in Queensbury, and it's a great place to walk around with exercise. You can fish in the pond. There's a playground there. I always walk my dog down there. So I was walking the dog one time, and I saw this granite marker there. And on the marker was like a bronze plaque, and it lists all the activities that happened at Halfway Brook. And I became just amazed by it. And I did a little more research, and they talk about Fort Amherst being there. Now, Fort Amherst was built in 1759 on the south side of the brook, and the stockaded fort that I talked about was on the north side. And so I started to do some more research, and I found all these interesting things about what happened. Rogers Rangers always came through Halfway Brook on their way north or south. Many convoys came through. Troops would march through. Provincial reinforcements would come through. So it's a very interesting place there, Halfway Brook. So you can get a lot of information from that plaque, but there's more information in the articles that we published in the Fort George Post. I did 2 parts, and I'm due to do a 3rd part for John DiNuzzo, and he's always after me to get that done, and I'll get to it, don't worry.
Thank you, Bruce. But as Bruce said, they are very popular articles. The winter of 2022, summer of 22 issues of the Fort George Post, available on the website, lakegeorgebattlefield.org. Just click the newsletter tab and go down to winter 22, summer 22. One last thing on Halfway Brook, Bruce. Was Halfway Brook at all part of the Knox Noble Artillery Train?
Yes. Henry Knox, of course, brought the cannon from Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga south on Lake George, unloaded at Fort George, used the military road. He would have crossed Halfway Brook. In fact, in his diary, he refers to it as 7 Mile Brook. Robert Rogers called it the Bloody Brook because of the massacres that I alluded to earlier. General Redazel, during the Saratoga campaign, he was Burgoyne's commander of German troops. He would have come down this way and stayed for a short time at the ruins of Fort Amherst. So you had that part of the 1777 campaign crossing over at Halfway Brook. So it has a long history here during the colonial period, and it's a very important brook. Not very wide, but very important.
Okay, and the Hovey Park area in Queensbury, was that all part of the Fort Amherst encampment?
It was all part of it. Right around that area, you had Fort Amherst, you had the stockaded area, they had storehouses. They would bring their supplies from Fort Edward, put them in the storehouses, and then bring them forward. It was quite an installation.
Well, again, that is part of the two-part series that Bruce presented in our newsletter back in 2022. We urge you to read that, and we'll all await part 3 of the Halfway Brook story. Thank you, Bruce Vetter.
You're welcome.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on Lake George Radio, 93.5 FM, and live streaming at lakegeorgeradio.com. If you have any questions regarding Lake George Battlefield Moments, email info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org. And tune in every Saturday morning at 9:45 for Lake George Battlefield Moments.